So today we're going to go through element types and transaction types. And as you're probably already aware, or can surmise from the names, these are two little areas within FinPower Connect that have wide impacts throughout the system, and there's a high level of understanding of the configuration in FinPower Connect and the needs of the business that is required when completing the initial configuration for a client's database. Today we'll go through most of the settings and point out areas to watch for. You may remember this wee diagram from our session on the bank account showing the relationship flow for bank transactions. Drawing particular attention this time, we can see how the element and transaction type link together and how they're connected to other parts of the system. So what is the difference and the purpose of each? In short, transaction types are specifically used by the bank account and in batches and are not mandatory for all transaction types. They are a way of grouping sets of bank and journal transactions and facilitating overrides on import and export services, as an example. Elements are the underlying key for all transactions and define default settings for things like default allocations for transactions using that element, default disbursement configurations for things like loan advances and subsequent payout transactions, defining commission elements if applicable, credit and rebates if applicable, GL accounts, etc. Delving a little bit deeper into element types now, not elephant. Elements enable the analysis or breakdown of all amounts for the account from cash price, extra charges, interest, finance charges, deposits, payments, journals and fees, and so on. They are therefore the smallest component or element of the account's balance. There are elements for each component or value in the original account and also for any transaction entered against it once it is written. As such, if we have a look at this image here, we can see a little bit more of the extended reach of the elements and their links throughout FinPower Connect. On the element type in the admin library, we set the following, starting with element types. There are 17 available element types, and I've grouped them in the image here based on the available default balance allocations for these types. For example, the element types of interest, default interest and interest payout can only be allocated to interest balances, and this cannot be changed. Refunds can be defaulted to or allocated to any of the 5 allocation options and are unique in this way, meaning in theory you could refund interest if you needed to. The payment due and payment received element types are defined by core FinPower Connect, which we'll cover shortly in more depth, and the remaining element types can only choose between non-interest bearing based allocations, fees, principal, etc. Once the element has all of the necessary configurations, it can then be linked in the following ways. The account type defines elements for system events such as debit interest transactions, account close elements, balance adjustments, etc., as well as optional items such as standard transactions, fees, and so on. On the bank account, on the payment method, if a fee is to be charged, on import and export services, the transaction type gets linked, which in turn defines the attached element, and on the import service rules to override the element type based on set criteria if required. They can be set on a document type for fees associated with certain document types, on external parties for the commission rules, the transaction type as mentioned, and by scripting where appropriate. They can also be selected on accounts themselves when adding an ad hoc standard transaction or ongoing, disbursement or accounting ledgers. They're also available as a range filter for various reports and things, as we went over a couple sessions ago. Looking at the form itself briefly, it's fairly straightforward to follow, provided you know the specifications for the client's requirements. Like with most areas of FinPower Connect, this form is dynamic, showing different options for relevant settings based on underlying element type and what the client is licensed for. We'll take a quick look at a few of the demo elements, such as the loan advance element here. And on the general page, we can see we have the type of advance. The balance in this list is the other 17 odd element types that are available. The other options down here, we can see the advance is allocated straight to principal. And this principal balance means that interest will accrue against it versus the principal non-interest bearing balance. This one is a really good example of how the disbursements can be set, as an example, including defining related elements for the actual disbursements themselves. So in this case, the advance gets paid out to an external party under a dealer type, and it's being paid out in full. There are various options available there, which will be covered in its own session on disbursements. Whereas if we have a look at the interest one, on the general page here, as mentioned, you cannot change the allocation. So even if you're in edit mode, the allocation is stuck there on interest, and some of the other options are also not available. If we review a fee type element, here on the general page, you can see we have an allocation of fees and not fees non-interest bearing, so these ones would accrue interest. And we have the option to include as income. There's also the option to select of is payment due immediately, and the subsequent option of direct debiting immediately. With this option selected, the overdue balance on an account is impacted straight away, making it due that day and potentially incurring default interest if it is not paid on that day, depending on other account type related settings. So it's important to note that. User flags A and B are available for use by scripts and where appropriate external applications, as with other areas throughout the system, and these can be labelled to something more meaningful in global settings. Under the comparison rate options, we have the ability to capitalise the value should the client wish to do so, and the ability to select a region where applicable. I think HELP mentions New South Wales, that being relevant in particular for. The insurance option is a really good example for setting up potential credit and rebate options. For example, an upfront charge for insurance could have been made as an opening transaction. This facility allows the ability to rebate or credit back some of that value should the loan close prior to maturity. And it's quite a common instance that we see throughout many of our clients. If we navigate to the GL accounts page on this element, you can see this is where the GL accounts can be linked if the client is utilising those features within FinPower Connect, as well as defining the accounting ledger options if they are licensed accordingly. The authorization page allows you to optionally flag a transaction as requiring authorization. It's really important to note here, however, that this flag does not stop a transaction from being exported or processed and requires the user to authorize it, but it's essentially a facility to assist the client with audit requirements where applicable for transaction approvals rather than a system-based hard stop. Coming back to the payment allocations, we touched on this, the allocations of the elements themselves, but we now cover how FinPower Connect allocations work in terms of receiving payments in. So the allocation of the payment determines the just lost my place. We discussed that there were some element types of payment due and payment received and things that are covered by core FinPower Connect. So when a payment comes in, the system automatically allocates to the balances in this order. So first and foremost, if there is an outstanding fee balance, the payment will be allocated to that, then filtering down as we go through to fees non-interest bearing, interest, then principal, and then finally principal non-interest bearing balance. What this means is it's really important to get the allocation settings on your element right, or this can have an impact on the calculations in the schedule, and is something that comes up quite a bit through our support inbox for queries relating to this. For example, a balance allocated to the non-interest-bearing principal will not be paid until all other balances on the account are at zero. A recent example we've seen is where a fee is charged as an opening transaction and allocated to fees non-interest bearing. The fee amount or balance itself does not accrue interest, as in the name, non-interest bearing, but because of the way allocations work, the first incoming payment to the loan required a large portion of it to clear that balance before being subsequently allocated to the next default allocations, in this case being interest. So in this scenario, interest is still being accrued on a higher balance than the client expected it would be because of a lack of understanding on how payments are allocated and them not realising that there is not an issue with how FinPower Connect is completing the interest calculation, as it's still calculating on the outstanding principal interest-bearing balance and interest on interest if applicable, etc. But it's an issue with when and how the client thought the non-interest-bearing balance would be repaid. And this is one of the reasons, again, why it's important to understand not only how the allocations themselves work, but also the requirements of the client. If the client does need to change the allocations of a transaction for whatever reason on the account, there are wizards that facilitate this, as well as scripting options available. Moving on to transaction types themselves. They must have an element attached. For example, on the general page here, you can see it's in blue, which means it is a mandatory field. And as mentioned, these are a way of differentiation within FinPower Connect for similar transactions where separations exist. For example, under our bank account import and export services, transaction types can be set to differentiate between different services and are also used for batches. They can also be selected by a user with the appropriate permissions in various instances throughout FinPower Connect, like for SMS fees, if enabled on the cost center when entering an ad hoc transaction, and when using the import-export bank transactions or editing batches. So that was a fairly quick one today. We've come to the end of the session. There's a lot more we could have covered, but I think we'll leave it there for now. But as always, if there's any additional information you seek, don't hesitate to contact application support for user interface queries or code support in relation to code-specific questions. In our next session, we'll be covering Task Manager folders and tasks.